Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa Marginelli. I'm editor-in-chief at Issues in Science and Technology, a quarterly journal that's a partnership between the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University, and we are sponsoring this event today. I'm really happy to introduce today's discussion. How can taxpayer-funded science yield drugs that are innovative and affordable? Before I introduce the speakers and the moderator, I want to say just a little bit about our general purposes in these events. In part, we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way that science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. And such a discussion requires not only experts, but lots of other people, which is to say society, which is to say everyone here on the chat. And everyone here in this webinar. So about the first half of today's event is a moderated discussion between our moderator and panelists. And then the second half includes questions from you in the audience, so that the panel is engaging with the questions that you feel are important. To enter your questions, use the Q&A function, which you'll find along the very bottom of the webinar screen. And you can use the chat function to chat amongst yourselves, and we will be in it as well, but the panelists will be paying attention to the conversation. So let's get started. The moderator today is Anna Maria Berry-Jester, who is a reporter with ProPublica covering global health. Thank you, Anna Maria. And we have 4 panelists. They are John LaMattina, Senior Partner at Pure Tech Health. He is also the former Head of Research and Development at Pfizer. We have Mariana Mazzucato, who's a professor at the University College London, and the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's also the author of many books, including The Entrepreneurial State, and she is the chair of the World Health Organization's Economics for Health for All. Next person is Bhavan Sampath. He was a professor at Arizona State University, and he's also at the Consortium for Science, CSPO, the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Travis Whitfill, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Azitra. So I'll turn this over to Anna Maria, and thank you all for coming. We look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm looking forward to a lively and engaged conversation today. Let's jump right in. Mariana, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. There have been debates for decades about the high prices of drugs in the U.S., and in your book, The Entrepreneurial State, you look at how taxpayers often fund the riskiest research and play a really key role in innovation. And you've also written extensively about the need to better balance the public good in the pharmaceutical sector. So to open, I wondered, where do you think the balance between affordability and innovation is off right now? What are the key issues that need solving?
So thank you for that question. It's a good opening one. So what I've been trying to emphasize over the years is that the answer to your question, which is a critical one, has to begin with the narrative and the story we actually tell about where innovation comes from. So as long as the justification in theory, forget what happens in practice, in theory, is that government is there just to fix different types of market failures or incentivize the private sector to create value, regulate that value, redistribute the value, enable, de-risk, blah, 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 all these boring words, the private sector, then it's actually impossible to change the dysfunctionality in the system, which then comes from the fact that in most sectors, including the one we're talking about today, health, the state has done much more than that. It has actually created markets or co-created. It's always about public and private. It's never one or the other. Co-created markets. It has done so definitely in health, in IT, today in the clean tech sector, by actually investing early on during the more high-risk phase, often the more capital-intensive phase in some sectors, and then it doesn't actually think in a pre-distributive way how to make sure that that high-risk investment is then also matched with a socialization of the rewards. In other words, we socialize the risks and we privatize the rewards. In this sector, in the United States, for example, you have over $40 billion a year that the National Institutes of Health invest. This isn't about regulation. This is investment, high-risk investment in drug innovation. And then the patents that we have don't reflect that. So what do I mean by that? Patents are badly governed. Patents are a contract between the public and the private sector. You get a 17-year monopoly. But in order to make sure that the public, and by that I mean people, benefit, then the spillovers have to actually be quite wide once the patent is up. But if in the meantime, we have allowed patents to be very, very wide, just used for strategic reasons, very, very strong, hard to license, and upstream, way too upstream, so the tools for research are actually being privatized, then the patent system becomes dysfunctional. And especially in a sector where the state has used taxpayer money to make those high-risk investments, it's really important for it to know how to govern all the different tools, which then could actually make sure that we have as much spillovers of knowledge over time, at least, not necessarily within those 17 years. And then the pricing, we have this theory of value-based pricing, but again, it's just a story, and it has basically allowed the prices of drugs to go to whatever the market will bear. And then you have the welfare states around the world, if they exist, to subsidize that price. So basically, taxpayers are paying 2 or 3 different times. What you should have is the right price ex ante that reflects that collective value creation between public, private, also third sector, like philanthropic institutions, and the prices to again reflect that kind of co-investment instead of allowing the pharmaceutical industry to basically charge again whatever the market will bear, because ultimately value-based pricing has allowed that. So I'll just stop there, otherwise I would go on and on. But just to say, this is a more general problem. And for me, it's about governing the innovation process with a common good kind of outlook. Why? Because ultimately what we need is, great innovations that solve big global problems. But if we misgovern that public-private relationship over time and allow it for it to be parasitic, not symbiotic, we end up with the problems we have today in this sector.
Okay, great. I think that framework of value from a taxpayer or public perspective is a great framework for this conversation. John, you've spent decades in the industry with most of your career running R&D at Pfizer. And you've also written a book, Pharma and Profits, and you describe how you think conversations around high drug prices don't properly take into account the value that drugs bring. And also sometimes misplace broader concerns about high cost of healthcare in the US onto the pharma sector. I'm wondering, do you think there is an affordability problem with drugs in the US?
To be honest, I think the issue in the United States is not affordability, but really the lack of insurance on part of some people and the poor insurance that other people have, unlike in the rest of the world. I need to push back a little bit on the innovation comments that were just made. We have to detail the scope of the problem that we're talking about here with patents and what and the NIH does terrific work. Very early on, I would challenge whether or not that's the most difficult part of the work. But in any case, I think it was Dr. Sampat in his paper talked about how the NIH-based discoveries contributed to about 20% of drugs that have been approved by the FDA. The Wall Street Journal took that back a bit late last year, said about 15%, but actually a very good paper coming out of Vital Transformations analyzed all the FDA drugs that were approved between 2011 and 2020 and found that of the 329 of these drugs, basically out of the 361 of these drugs over 10 years, only 29 had basically federal partnerships associated with those drugs. No doubt what the NIH does is important, and no doubt it can be the starting point, but the general impression that most Americans have is that everything that the drug industry produces comes out of government-funded research, and that all the industry does is basically manufacture and sell these things at profit. So I think the scope of the problem, while real, is overstated.
Okay, so you do think that taxpayer money is a key driver of innovation, but not to the extent that the public understands it.
It can be a driver. I've got some tremendous examples I can give if you'd like, but where the NIH breakthrough was important discovery of a key drug. But basically, the risk that industry takes is that various hypotheses come out of research labs funded by the NIH or in universities. A certain enzyme is associated with maybe causing Alzheimer's disease. It's the industry that then goes in and spends billions of dollars to come up with an inhibitor of that enzyme, to take it through clinical trials, and eventually get it to market. What the industry does is prove or disprove hypotheses made out of academic labs, and nobody appreciates that.
So let's not underestimate the role that they play in later stage development. Travis, you come at this with experience as an academic, a venture capitalist, a biotech co-founder. What do you make of sort of Mariana and John and the disconnect?
Yeah. So I've sort of been at most sides of the table of drug development, so to speak, from academic to an investor and now as a drug developer. I think there is a middle ground here. I think that the government plays a critical role in early stage innovation, but things have gotten kind of out of control. I will mention that that pharmaceutical spending in the U.S. only makes up a very small amount of total healthcare spending. So I think to contextualize this problem, it is a problem, but I think the payer system and our general healthcare system has larger issues. But I'll just kind of stick within the context of biopharma. But I'll take Moderna as a great example as kind of where things can go right and wrong. Moderna has received funding a lot from the NIH, but they also received a lot of DoD funding, which I think we often forget is the Defense Department has the largest budget in the U.S. by far, and they actually fund more healthcare innovation than I think a lot of federal agencies. But anyway, Moderna received a lot of funding from the Department of Defense early on in development. Before COVID, they had really no assets. They had a couple, phase 2 programs that didn't really show much. They made a really smart investment in pivoting to COVID and tackling COVID, kind of literally weeks after the full genome was sequenced of SARS-CoV-2, and they were incredibly successful. But they ended up overcharging for the COVIDs. There was some problems with access to third world countries, access in South Africa, for example, where they were doing a lot of the sequencing and a lot of the work driving the global kind of coalition for innovation for COVID. And what I think is problematic is the pharmaceutical executives of Moderna's team made $1 billion in share buybacks from COVID. And some of them left. There's a golden parachutes with the CEO. It's all legal, of course, because you can have these programs where you can sell off stock at regular intervals, things like that. But I think that's part of the discussion too. Is the government played a huge role in kind of the COVID response, and I'm talking back to 2016 with the pandemic prevention program from the DoD. Or from DARPA actually that funded a lot of the really foundational work for the COVID mRNA vaccines. So in this conversation, I would just kind of like to tackle that the government plays a huge role when their executives made $1 billion. Legal, yes, but should it be legal?
So questions of should so much of that value go to sort of executives and pharmaceutical sector as opposed to coming back to the public who maybe made a huge investment. Okay. Bhavin, you've researched history and policy around the role of private sector funding for pharmaceutical innovation. I wonder, what are a couple of important things you think are either misunderstood or poorly understood about the role of taxpayer financing? So either what are we getting wrong when we have these kinds of discussions, or what don't we know that could make the discussions more grounded in reality?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel. I will say, well, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know, and maybe I can come back to some of that later. But I just want to pick up on some places where I agreed and disagreed with different things that others said. I won't go too deep into questions about the statistics that John had cited, but I think this idea of taxpayer-funded drugs, it lumps together various things that need to be unlumped a little bit. And this is, I think, consistent with what John said and what Mariana laid out up front. Under a broad definition, did the NIH do any research related to the drug? I think probably close to 100% of drugs. There's some NIH-funded research, and there's a few papers that say that. I actually think that fact is sort of interesting, but from the perspective of thinking about pricing and whatnot, it's not actionable. It's not that useful from a policy perspective. Then when we get closer to some of the numbers that John cited, yeah, I mean, I think 15-20% of drugs, maybe important drugs, have at least one publicly funded or public sector patent. But then if you look at drugs that have all public sector patents, which is, I think, what you would need for things like margin rights and whatnot to be effective, you start getting to the 2% range or something like that. So the point is that different ways of thinking about this and different ways of measuring this have very different policy implications for thinking about prices and whatnot. But the bigger picture thing I wanted to say, and this gets back to some of the historical work that you pointed to, Anna, is we have designed a system, or maybe more precisely, a system emerged out of the ashes of World War II, where we sort of count on the public sector to do basic research and drug companies motivated by profits to do the costly trials and other development work ultimately needed to bring the drugs to market. I do think it's an overstatement to say that all the private sector is doing is privatizing public sector research. That just seems wrong and somewhat reductive to me. So for me, like, there's two important questions: one inside the box and one sort of outside of the box. The inside the box question is, given that system we have, the key question to me is how to design patent, payment, and other policies so that drug company profits are correlated with the incremental social or clinical value that they're making. And I think that's a discussion we should be having for all drugs, not whether they're 10%, 20%, or 40% taxpayer funded. Or second, and this relates to some of what was laid out in Travis and Mariana's issues article, we could change the system. Do we want the public sector to actually be doing more downstream work, more late-stage commercialization, so we aren't so reliant on private sector profit motives to do there? So they talk about it as a full pipeline model. I've talked about it as an end-to-end model. And I think those are two important questions that we need to think about going forward.
Okay, great. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I actually agree with almost everything everyone said. And I think what we shouldn't do, otherwise we'll waste everyone's time, including our own, is to create this straw man. Like, no one is saying that this is publicly funded research just being privatized by the private sector. I've never written that. I don't think that. This is an industry that has required and will require private actors, small, medium, and large. It's not just big pharma, it's also small biotech. It requires different types of public funding, of which there's lots of different types. What we need to get is the right ecosystem. If you speak to a biologist, they won't let you just say ecosystem. They'll say, is it symbiotic? Is it mutualistic? Is it predator-prey? So how do we get these different actors to work well together across the whole innovation chain? And there's actually some really good research by people like Ashish Arora. I can't remember the name of the article, but it had the word goose in it for some reason, where they actually look at how over time, the division of innovative labor between public and private institutions has become too separate, too much that there's publicly funded research upstream and the downstream is more by the private sector, because there was real advantages actually when that boundary was a bit more fuzzy. There was interesting outcomes that happened when some of the problems themselves were set together. And when you get this very strict division of labor, it has almost like sterilized some of the research. But beyond that, I think that share buyback point is really interesting. And I've written about Pfizer's share buybacks for a long time, because I actually happen to be the biggest share buybacker across many different sectors, by the way, or one of the biggest, along with Exxon and so on. By the way, what are share buybacks? It's when a corporate governance structure based on maximizing shareholder value, when decisions are made in the corporate boardroom to buy back shares. Now, why that happens, there's different reasons, sometimes really good reasons if there's no opportunity to do anything else with those funds. But when it's excess share buybacks, that's what we're talking about, we might consider that to be a problem. So just to put things in perspective, in the US, close to 7 trillion, that's 12 zeros, have been used by the largest 500 companies on buybacks, which boost stock prices, stock options. And you'll remember that executives mainly get paid through stock options. So executive pay and the huge widening gap between executive pay and other pay in many companies has been widening because of these practices. Capital gains tax then doesn't tax that enough, so on and so forth. But in pharma, between 2012 and 2021, share buybacks of the largest 14 companies amounted to close to 800 billion, so much more than the 600 billion they invested in R&D over the same period. One could say, fine, do what you want. But one of the things, instead of just talking about prices, one could say, why aren't there conditions attached, for example, to the NIH funding, which say, if you want to benefit from this taxpayer contribution, which is very high risk, a lot of that innovation doesn't actually lead to anything, as any venture capitalist will tell you is the case most of the time. The profits that are generated on the back of that high risk innovation have to be reinvested back in, right? That, by the way, has been used recently in the CHIPS Act in the United States by Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo. So the close to 400 billion in different types of public funding to semiconductor companies precisely puts that as one of the conditions. And it's kind of like not rocket science. If you want to use this, public funding, well, don't just give it back to shareholders, which of course the industry doesn't just give it back to shareholders, but that's what, and I see John wants to come in, so I promise John 2 seconds. That's I think should be part of the conversation. This is not just about prices, it's about behavioral change between public and private actors.
John, before we go to you, I wanted to ground this in the specific proposals that Travis and Mariana made to use an agency that's recently created, to spur biomedical innovation, to also think about innovation and financing. So Travis, I wonder if you could quickly outline sort of some, a couple of the proposals of how you might do that. And then John, I'll let you react to all of it, I promise.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, in our article, I'm trying to be practical here, because I think that as soon as you talk about margin rights, which we did propose as one of the options here, and I personally think that we should have that discussion, but as soon as that's mentioned in any kind of conversation with anyone in the industry, everyone just explodes, and it doesn't lead to any productive conversations. Because they think that once you start enacting the margin rights for any government agency, that would just kind of open the door to too many problems. So we did propose that, but I think a very practical solution, and I think one that all the different actors in the whole innovation system can get on board with is we have proposed having a kind of venture capital model in this new agency for ARPA-H, where and there's precedence for this with the CIA and their NQTEL program, but where they actually get stock and they get equity in the company, so in exchange for the grants that they're giving. And I think that kind of model should be discussed more, I think, because for the traditional venture capitalists, like when I was in VC, we had a very shorter window of like 10 years where we had to see a return. But the government can be a lot more patient, and the government is able to have a much longer window of seeing returns. So that way, they would give out this, a large sum of money, take some form of equity, stock, whatever in the company, and that way, if there is value captured later on, when the drug is commercialized, the government could get a piece of that return. And I think I'm sorry.
Oh no, please.
Yeah, and a third proposal that we had mentioned is some kind of conditionality where limiting excessive profiteering, executive compensation, drug prices. I think with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., having price conditions on medicines like insulin, for example, I think that's all for discussion too.
Okay, great. Please go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add a key bit of what we propose? Because without that, it's not a complete picture. What we argue is that an ARPA-H should do what kind of DARPA does, which is precisely to bring together into one agency. That doesn't mean you make the NIH into an ARPA-H. NIH should stay. We should have the existing ecosystem, but an ARPA-H would actually bring together what DARPA does, which is that there's a innovation kind of question, big bets, high-risk innovation being funded, but because they're often around the military-industrial complex, they have then bargained very well, precisely through margin rights, with the companies. So when DARPA has funded health innovation, they haven't actually allowed themselves to get, taken for a ride. Why? Because they want to win wars, right? They want to make the soldiers on the battlefields actually have access to the medicines that they co-fund with the industry. So that confidence that the military seems to have because of the urgency, national security, they then know how to structure the system. So we kind of are also just saying, hey, given that health is also a security question, it's absolutely critical to have a healthy population and so on. Why don't we get courageous, like DARPA is, with linking innovation and access?
Okay,
John,
great.
please.
John, yeah, thanks, John. And I'm also definitely interested in this question of couldn't it be beneficial to biotech and pharmaceutical sector to have, investors like the government who might be more interested in a long scale time frame? But please go ahead and respond. I know there's a lot there to talk about.
Okay, so a few things. One, in Mariana's comments about stock buybacks, the biopharmaceutical industry invests 25% top line revenues into R&D. No other industry comes close to that. Google, Apple at 25%, which means that if you take $1 billion out of their revenues, $250 million comes out of R&D. Very capital, a lot of investment there. You want to talk about stock buybacks. A company has to have investors. It has to provide returns to investors. Otherwise, they go downhill. And you don't have anything to invest in R&D. With respect to COVID, Travis, I agree with everything you said with respect to Moderna. However, in Pfizer's case, Pfizer took not a penny from the government. Pfizer risked $2 billion. And this comes back to the risk again. mRNA as a vaccine was totally unprecedented. Yeah, there were theories and stuff, but it wasn't until the COVID came and Pfizer and Moderna actually got abilities to generate these vaccines in a record amount of time, which, by the way, the pricing of those was unbelievably reasonable. Pfizer was the most expensive at $39 for the 2-shot regimen. That's half the price of a flu vaccine, 10% of the price of other vaccines for shingles and things like that. And that was only in the Western nations. In fact, middle-income countries, Pfizer charged only $20. In low-income countries, they gave it at cost. And in poor countries, they gave it away for free. So pretty responsible pricing in an area where admittedly they made a lot of money. But the value of those vaccines based on the Commonwealth Fund analysis showed that almost $1 trillion was saved thanks to in the first 16 months of the vaccine being available in terms of deaths, healthcare costs, hospital costs, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, margin rights. This experiment has been done before. Margin rights were in Bayh-Dole originally, but that was meant basically to say, hey, look, if somebody gets a license and then doesn't do anything with that license, we have the right to go back in and give it to somebody who will actually try and capitalize on that license. And so Bob Dole was against any sort of margin rights when it came, and he died a couple of years ago, and he wrote an op-ed about this, was against margin right in terms of pricing. Now, having said that, in the 90s, Congress did pass a provision about in a reasonable federal technology called reasonable pricing provision. And once that happened, companies stayed away from acting on any of these licenses. I mean, before Bayh-Dole, only 5% of 30,000 licenses were even utilized. But when you start putting in words that say the government will then have control over where you can charge, everybody backs away. And it's not just the companies, it's investors, it's venture capitalists. And so that's part of the comment about how many of these really exist. You will take off a certain percentage. I don't know if it's 5%, 10%, 20, 25%, whatever. All those intellectual property things will go off the table because the industry will not focus on those. They'll focus on things where such rights don't exist. One other point in talking about benefits. So far, to my knowledge, the University of Pennsylvania, thanks to their mRNA vaccine patents, has made $1.7 billion. I'm sure Arizona State or any other university would love to have access to royalties of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you. We're gathering all of the audience questions, so please do put them in the Q&A or chat. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. But before we get to those, Bhavin, I wanted to ask you, some of your research, I really like this framing you have that talks about how U.S. policies have done a good job of spurring commercialization of government-funded research, which is in many ways their intended goal, but not necessarily affordability. And please correct me if that is not a good summary. But with that in mind, I'm curious what you make of Mariana and Travis's proposal. And also, I think you've looked at why not also, in some cases, have the government see the funding of drug development all the way through, as opposed to more of a venture capitalist model of investing in a company. And I wonder how you think about those two options in the trade-offs.
Yeah, I think they're of. Thank you. I think they're of the same. They're of the same spirit, which is. I think we all agree that it sounds like that the government doesn't do it all at this point, but it could do more downstream, right? And if it did more downstream, the case for some sort of conditionality would be stronger than in a system where we're counting on private sector profit incentives to go the last mile, the last 2/3 or whatever. And so I think that the proposal, I found it to be quite interesting. I actually have some specific implementation questions, which probably aren't worth our time, but I mean, I think it's one question is just where ARPA-H is now at the scale it is now. I mean, at what scale could this be? Could this actually happen? Is this going to be 1 or 2 drugs, et cetera, et cetera? But I think in general, you asked at the beginning, Anna, things I think I don't know. I think there's been very limited experimentation in different ways of doing things in the biomedical innovation system. And so I certainly would support at ARPA-H or elsewhere experimentation with the types of mechanisms that are being proposed. I think an interesting question is how you would evaluate whether that experiment's actually working, right? But that's my response there. Can I just say, I know we want to turn to audience questions. Could I try to say very quickly a few things on March-in, which came up a few times?
Yes, please. The hot topic of March-in rights.
Yeah. I promised like 10 years ago never to talk about March-in rights again, but here I am. Okay. I think. I think in a way, I mean, by the way, one of the things I don't know, again, another thing I don't know is what we economists would say the elasticity of commercialization with respect to margin rights. So if you actually said, okay, we are now going to use margin with respect to prices, what would you lose? Would you lose? I mean, I think directionally, you'd probably have some folks say, developing these drugs coming out of NIH funding is risky. You're going to add additional conditionality. I'm not going to do it. Are you going to lose 1%, 10%, 50%? I don't know. And I don't think, I don't know how we would know that. There are some examples, as John pointed to, from the CRADA experiments that were done during the Varmus era and the reasonable prices. But I mean, that's essentially one data point. A lot of things were changing before and after, and it's really, really hard to make strong inferences one way or another, from my perspective, about what this would actually do, which to me tells me we actually do need to try different things out. We do need experimentation so that we can learn, so that we're not having the same debates, that we had 75 years ago. We're having them today, and so we're not having the exact same debate 75 years from now. Just one thought on the point that John made about Bob Dole and March-in. Yes, Bob Dole did come out and say he never meant for March-in rights to be about prices, but 98 other senators voted for the Bayh-Dole Act too. And as I read the legislative history of Bayh-Dole, the long-standing liberal opposition to allowing contractors and grantees to keep title to government-funded patents, it never would have gone through if March-in rights were as circumscribed as Bob Dole viewed them to be in his Washington Post op-ed way back when.
Okay, so going back to the previous point, even if ARPA-H were sort of a small scale, it could be really valuable in trying to experiment a little bit before we sort of try and establish large scale policy, that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to jump to some audience questions for a second here. Let's start with, we have a question from Daniel Erlinson who asks, Mariana, you suggest that patents lead to high drug prices, but how do you respond to the fact that there are shortages of many off-patent drugs such as Adderall? How do you think about that?
I actually didn't say that it's the patents that lead to high drug prices. They definitely contribute to it. I said that the way that the patent system is governed actually goes against what the patent system is for. It's a contract between two parties. So, for example, I've been against the patent box tax policy. which allows profits that are generated from patents to be eligible for a massive tax reduction. It makes no sense. And I don't know any innovation economist who supports it. Why does it make no sense? The fact you already have a 17-year monopoly takes care of the so-called incentive to innovate. So the pharmaceutical industry has been very good at lobbying for policies like the patent box, which ultimately have just increased their profits and haven't actually created any extra incentive for the innovation. There's all sorts of changes we can make to the patent system. Someone called Richard Nelson, has written a lot about that. Precisely those problems that I talked about, the fact that patents are too upstream, too wide, too strong, is just a bad governance. In terms of many off-patent drugs being in shortage, I'm sure the other people here on the panel might have other points to make about that, but that's a whole other issue, which is making sure that we make it easier if you want to create the generic version of drugs. Again, there's been lots of ways in which the industry has also extended artificially the patent time, but in this case, the question is about drugs that then don't have the patents, and that's precisely the problem, right? That this shouldn't be that you're only producing what you can make a lot of money from. This should be an agreement over the course of that drug that in exchange for benefits that you're given, like monopoly profits, there's nothing natural in a patent. I always go back to that. It's a contract. It's something the state is giving the private sector, because monopoly profits, one could argue, goes against the whole free market, right? Like that's where you often have a bit of a, what can one say? Divergence from those same people who argue for free markets, then they want monopoly profits, then they want to be able to use against state investment. So perhaps, especially for those drugs that are absolutely critical for the health and well-being of the population, so due to the different types of diseases, whether it's cancer, diabetes, and so on, that we actually look at the full course of a drug's life, how to make sure that then generic versions of those drugs do become available, and especially the patent system doesn't get abused, like the what was that called, the something Haxman Act, which allowed patents to be going overboard. Yeah, sorry, what was it called? The Hatch-Waxman Act, right? Yeah, which just by say testing that same drug on children, so all these drugs were tested on children just to be able to extend the patent life beyond 17 years. So it's just about making sure the patent system isn't gamed, if you want. But I don't know if someone else, Bhavin or someone, wants to talk about the off-patent drugs and their quantity on the market.
Yeah, John, let me tie in one other question from the audience that I think is related to this, which is that much of today's conversation is focused on, this is from Zachary Cribbs, has focused on establishing the right balance of risk and reward for public and private investors in innovation. So what questions should stakeholders use to encourage public and private investment when it's not so much about innovation, when we're talking about maybe perhaps, a drug that's already in existence but is needed, and trying to make sure that the pharmaceutical sector wants to invest there?
Is that for me?
Yeah, that I think ties in with kind of what Mariana was saying.
Sure. So a couple of things. Certainly, that has existed in the past, and the problem is if somebody finds a potential use for a new drug, you still have to do all the clinical trials and do all the experiments needed to get FDA approval. Right? You just can't. It's been approved for one indication. It could be a different dose, a totally different condition that may or may not work. So you still have to go through that. Having said that, I think there does exist mechanisms where you can get a short patent life for using that for that type of indication going forward. That's all going to be impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act and will probably change going forward. I want to come back to the question about drugs going off patent, which in my mind is the great American drug deal. Unlike surgical procedures that go up and up in cost every year, a drug, once it goes off patent, becomes available literally for pennies a day. So the third most prescribed drug in the world, in the United States anyway right now, is Lipitor, or the generic version of atorvastatin, which literally costs pennies a pill and is credited for saving and reducing the amount of heart attacks in this country by about 50%. Tremendous benefit that when we have a patent and it goes generic, you get a benefit. I'm not in agreement with Mariana's view about a contract, because once a compound goes generic, then anybody can make it, and you get tremendous competition involved, and the price drops through the floor. Where the Adderall thing comes up, and the problem is some drugs become so cheap that even generic manufacturers say it's not worth our while to make that anymore. And so there's been a few cases where that's happened. That's a good place for the government to step in and contract with generic manufacturers to make sure that sort of benefit availability contains. But the last thing I think you want to do is force the proprietary drug industry into generic drugs. They need to really use their resources to come up with the next great breakthroughs going forward.
Okay, so just to recap, you think that sort of a pre-purchasing model or something along those lines, where the federal government could step in with generics or with key public health drugs, essential drugs, and
I think
try to create a market there.
That happened with the COVID vaccines. In Operation Warp Speed, basically signed contracts with 6 different manufacturers, all with different ways to approach a COVID vaccine, guaranteeing that if they were successful going forward, they would actually buy those vaccines. And obviously for 4 companies, it didn't work very well. For the other 2, it worked pretty well. And there's, I think, a debate now ongoing to do the same sort of thing with antibacterials. With the Curie Act, I believe it is, looking to guarantee that the government will buy an antibiotic, which may not be needed now, but could prevent a major bacterial outbreak down the line.
Travis,
John,
something
can
to
I
add
just ask John a question? Why does Pfizer then charge less for the same medicine globally than it does in the US? Like, if I actually just want to know what the answer is to that question.
Sure, no, absolutely. And as I think it was Travis who said, or no, maybe it was Bob, everything in the United States is more expensive. People focus on drugs, but the fact of the matter is the aforementioned knee replacement and hip replacements are 25% the cost in Europe than in the United States. The whole healthcare system is out of whack in that regard. When you're dealing with other countries, you're dealing with one massive market. You're dealing with all of England. You're dealing with all of France, all of Germany. That's like dealing with one major payer here in the United States. And everybody focuses on the drug costs we know of are list prices. They're not the prices that insurance companies pay. Now you can say you should have more transparency there. We should know that. Those numbers are considerably less than the list price, which is paid by people with no insurance, unless they get benefits from the company, or people with poor, weak insurance as well. And now with the Inflation Reduction Act, the government will be paying cheaper prices for drugs going forward as well. So why is it more in the United States? The fragmented system, and I have to say, in all transparency, Marianne, the U.S. still pays more. The insurance companies will still pay more than Europe, but the amount of such isn't all that great. There was a great example a few years ago with hepatitis C vaccine pills. That it was $1,000 a pill, but at the end of the day, insurance companies negotiated their way down so that they were paying less than was being paid in Europe or France or Germany, which didn't really get a lot of play at that time.
I think the research suggests that even taking into account the discounts, sort of an across the board look would show that the U.S. pays about twice what Europeans pay for most pharmaceuticals.
And I would think that's right. Americans shoulder the burden of paying for R&D. So if you would have wave a magic wand and knock that price down to European prices, you'll see whole-scale layoffs across R&D industry, the whole R&D industry in biopharma.
Okay, Travis, I wanted to let you jump in. I think there's a lot there that you were maybe potentially going to respond to. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I agree with John that I think one of the areas the government could step in is antibiotics, because it's kind of really hard for pharma companies to develop those. But what I also wanted to say is kind of amplifying Mariana's point about the patent system. I think a concrete example of this is Abilify, which is a CNS drug that I think it was Otsuka was the manufacturer, made so many incremental changes to the formulation, patent that, to the indications, patent that. And then they, after so many different extensions of the patent, they made a minor modification to the actual molecule and then created a whole new brand and then started over and over. So I think that that's one of the problems in the patent system I just wanted to amplify is,
Travis, you are exactly right. And I would do away with that in a heartbeat. There are times when let's say Abilify was 3 times a day, and they come up with a novel formulation that makes it once a day. And in doing that, it's not just convenience, but you eliminate side effects that occur with rapid dosing. There are examples of that, but for the most part, you're entirely right. You get a patent, that should be the basic patent. And once that patent is up, generic manufacturers come in and start selling that material, no matter what tweaks you make to the Abilify plus whatever. Fully agree.
Thanks.
Can I just get on this point? And the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984 was mentioned, and and one thing that's interesting is that at least for small molecule drugs, for most important small molecule drugs, generic entry does tend to happen close to the expiration of the primary patent. Right, the secondary patents they end up getting challenged by generics, and that's actually a part of Hatch-Waxman. I mean, there's lots of things about Hatch-Waxman that haven't worked, but I think that's part of Hatch-Waxman that has worked. But I think the kind of question about evergreening and then product hopping and whatnot, it gets me back to just a comment I made earlier, which is I think the lodestar here really should be to create a system for drugs with public sector funding or any drugs at all, where drug company profits are aligned with therapeutic or social benefits. And so if they're taking out a patent that's giving them 10, 20 extra years, but there's no clinical benefit, I don't think those types of patents should be granted, essentially, right? And so to me, that aligning private value with social value, or profits with social value, seems like an important thing to be doing, and cuts across a number of the issues we've been talking about today.
And that's sort of what is done in a lot of other countries, right? Where there's essentially a value placed on the therapeutic value or the value of life, and then you look at how well a drug works and price accordingly. That's a sort of a standard thing
on the payment side. On the payment side, I'm saying that insight cuts across to thinking about patent policy and what kinds of patents you would want to allow, and what types of patents you would not want to allow.
So incorporating that into sort of the patent system and what would be granted a patent is also something you'd consider. Yeah,
there's more to say about that, but yes is the simple answer. Yes.
Okay. Well, to stay on that for a second, are there other things that we could learn from other countries? And Bhavin, maybe you want to start with that, and then I'd be curious to hear what other people think.
Well, the U.S. is the biggest biomedical innovation system, and a lot of, I think John alluded to this point in a way. John said, if we did what Europe did, then there'd be a lot of layoffs. Because I agree with John. I mean, in answer to Mariana's question, I mean, I think the U.S. taxpayer does, or U.S. citizens do essentially subsidize a lot of the R&D for the rest of the world. I personally think, both from an economic and ethical perspective, that's okay. But if we did, reference pricing and started to try to make our prices similar to the rest of the world, I mean, I think actually you might see price increases in the rest of the world, right? And so I think one lesson from the economics literature is reference pricing often hurts the referenced country, right? And so I think, I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know that there are great lessons to learn on the payment side from other countries. On the patent side, other countries have experimented to the extent they can through the TRIPS agreement with different ways to link patentability to therapeutic efficacy and whatnot. And that's been very, very controversial, and remains to be seen how well it's actually going to work.
Okay.
I think we look at other countries, and I think that there have been systems that have worked, I think, okay, of linking the value of a drug to its price. So in France, for example, they have this. Yeah, France, for example.
I see. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Sorry. No, I agree with that. I actually think that if you want to go where I propose we should go, which is link drugs to their social value, I think we need to have serious health technology assessment. And I think we can learn from other countries, but I also think the NIH should be investing in, the tools for doing this in a way that actually would value innovative drugs are underdeveloped. But I think we want to get that methodology to a point where it's reliable, robust, not gameable, et cetera, so that we can actually implement it. And I don't think it's there yet. But yes, indeed. Thank you, Travis. I think there is learning from other countries there.
Travis, is there anything else you wanted to add about other countries and models that might be informative for the United States?
Well, yeah, I mean, just NICE in the UK and the health technology assessments in France, for example. I mean, we have ICER in the US, but they have zero connection to actual pricing guidelines and the FDA approval process. ICER is the Institute for Cost-Effective Research, I believe, or something. Cost Evaluation Research does a lot of great work and provides pricing guidelines based on actual evidence. And usually there's a really big differential on what companies actually charge. And I think Mariana said earlier is a really good point of these companies can just price drugs to what the market can bear instead of actually having some kind of evidence-based approach to pricing. I'll just say in some examples, some cell and gene therapies that are coming out, gene therapies can cost upwards of $600,000 to millions of dollars a year. And we have only a few approved, but if we have more and more of those gene therapies priced at millions of dollars a year, that's going to be a huge problem in the next 5 to 10 and the growth to bigger patient populations.
I mean, one thing about prices is potentially, and I'm thinking also about lessons from other industries, how to de-link the incentives for investment in innovation in the sector to the price, that can be set. So there's all sorts of examples globally, including, the X prize, like using prize schemes, for example, especially for those areas where there isn't enough investment. But again, coming back to the fact that even in those areas that are kind of that lead to blockbuster commercializable drugs, we still have a lot of early stage public funding. There can be ways to, and there's been lots of literature on this, on de-link actually the investment innovation from the actual price of the drug. And just on the concept that Travis mentioned on venture capital, just to kind of dig deeper again from learning from other sectors, because it's not just other countries, but given that this sector has been criticized quite a bit in terms of this dysfunctional public-private. In Israel, again, they had a public venture capital fund where the public side, instead of just getting more and more taxpayer funds, the public pot, take an NIH type pot, would also get a percentage of the profits that are generated from, again, this sector, which is one of the most profitable sectors across all sectors. Take the energy industry. I always found it shocking that the Obama administration gave the same amount of money to Solyndra as they did to Tesla. And the taxpayer came out, had to bail out Solyndra, got nothing from Tesla. And the deal was that if Tesla didn't pay back the loan, the government wanted 3 million shares. It was like, why would you want 3 million shares in a company that doesn't pay back a loan? Had it been, we get 3 million shares if you do pay back the loan because you're a successful company, the price per share in Tesla during the time of that loan went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. So it's also about creating kind of a healthy, sustainable pot that is also kind of apolitical, that doesn't constantly require getting money from Congress, even though that's very important. And the NIH has been successful actually in getting its budget appropriation, but it's also about rewarding not only the taxpayer, but the people who are actually working in the NIH to make it also kind of, exciting job to have that some of the money that's generated comes back to the public pot.
Do you worry, Mariana or Travis, that having the public sector take equity in drug companies puts the NIH on the side of high drug prices?
What's the
NIH? That it would be in their interest to have the higher profits.
It'd be in their interest. I mean, the NIH cares, if there's one thing the NIH has cared about historically, it's its budget. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And that's why the design of this needs a lot of care. So it all depends what you think the motivation is, right? And that goes back to public choice theory and all the literature by Buchanan. Are government officials just out there to either win elections or to pocket money, and they are just as greedy and focused on some equivalent of profits, just think of benefits, as the common firm is. So there's all sorts of ways that you could actually design an institution to make sure that that didn't happen, right? I mean, if it's a purpose-oriented institution designed into the remit of an organization, there's, I'm not saying it's easy, but that's sort of a cynical view that just because the public sector would be bringing back money, not to the civil servants, for example, but to a pot as a fair share. It's all about being fair, right? This isn't about, being greedy and bringing all the money back to the state. It's about getting a fair share back, whatever that share is. And again, that itself one could start talking about, as opposed to, again, socialization of risk, privatization of rewards. I mean, again, in terms of the international comparison, this is a very Anglo-Saxon way of thinking of capitalism.
The reason I raised it just very quickly, the political economy point is interesting. One of the things Bayh-Dole did was put universities on the side of lobbying for stronger patent rights, right? And so, I mean, thinking some of this through would be interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point.
I wanted to ask each of you one final question. I'm not sure we really have time for this, so if you can keep your answers to like 20 seconds, I'd love that. If you were going to make one very discrete, concrete policy change right now with the goal of benefiting specifically taxpayers, the public, what would it be? Let's start with you, John.
I don't know if you can see me. I've screwed things up, I believe, here. I think we touched on something very important before. The finite life of patents, I think, is a very real issue, and I fully support that. I think getting drugs to get generic as quickly as possible is the right thing to do. That's in fact the pact that companies have with the government, and that is we get a finite period of time to discover, to develop and sell these drugs, and when that's over, it should be available to everyone via generic market.
Wonderful, thank you. Bhavin, do you have a answer?
Yeah, I've already said it a few times, but yeah, I think linking drug profits to the incremental social value that drug companies are producing for all drugs is a useful North Star.
Okay, and how about you, Travis?
I mean, I have a difference between the most practical and most aspirational. I guess I'll break it down, but I would say the most practical would be what John and Bhavin just said. I think those are very realistic, but in the long term, I see ARPA-H as a playground and kind of like an experiment for how we can use a federal agency to have lower drug prices in the long term, and especially since they're involved in late stage clinical development. I think that's a possibility.
Great. And Mariana?
I would go back to my first point, which is really paying attention to the narratives and the stories we tell. As soon as anyone wants to mess with the patent system, what we hear from the industry is that that's going to hurt innovation. So a better understanding through evidence of where innovation has actually come from, of course, from the private sector, but also the exact role of these public actors. The mRNA example that John gave, there's plenty of articles. I just put one in the chat, which actually showed that, again, the early difficult research that actually got that technology off the ground was funded, again, by the taxpayer, and it's not to say that, Pfizer wasn't important. Of course it was, but we know that. What we don't know is the importance of the public actor, and what does that mean then to negotiate? Because this is about negotiation. That's why I keep saying patents are contracts, but it's not just about patents. Negotiate the right deal and get a fair share for what is a massive collective creation of value. And, this word collective intelligence is out there, but then we, turn it into a gambling machine.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think we have to end there. Thank you, everyone, for this fantastic conversation. Lisa, I'll hand it back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria, John, Mariana, Bhavin, and Travis. That was a really interesting conversation. One of the things that struck me was that, the patent system dates back to the earliest founding of this country, like right in the very first meetings about what this country was going to be. And of course, World War II and the sort of bifurcation of the way that drugs are investigated and developed and sold. And then those things have unintended consequences. And as we contemplate the coming policies to rectify things, we also have to think about the unintended consequences of those, of those policies. And this is just a fascinating spot to contemplate what the real role is of policy in creating public value. So thank you very much for that conversation. And if you like this kind of conversation, you've come to the right place. I hope you will join us for further events. You can find out about them by subscribing to our newsletter. And you can read everything we print, everything we write, everything we print, you can find at Issues in Science and Technology, which is at issues.org. And we hope to see you again sometime. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again to the panelists, to Anna Maria. This was a really strong and interesting conversation. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time, and have a fantastic rest of your day wherever you are in the world.